Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to welcome all of you to Akin Gump's webinar focusing on budget reconciliation. It's a very powerful, and as all of you know, a very complex process. I'm Joe Donnelly, and I'm honored to facilitate this very timely discussion. I'm joined today by some real all-stars. First is former House of Representative Parliamentarian Charles W. Johnson III. Mr. Johnson served the House of Representatives for more than 50 years. He was appointed as Assistant Parliamentarian in 1964 by then Speaker of the House, John McCormick. In 1994, he was appointed Parliamentarian of the House, a role he served in until 2004. Joining Mr. Johnson is Akin Gump Public Law and Policy Partner, Brendan Dunn. Brendan served as the chief advisor to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and the Senate Republican leadership on tax and trade, financial services, and retirement matters. Brendan was the key staff architect of the Majority Leader's successful effort to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is the last time that reconciliation has been used. Before we continue, just a couple of housekeeping items for everybody. The audience is on mute to prevent any background noise. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of our discussion. So there'll be a chat section in there. Please submit your questions through the presentation, throughout the presentation, using the chat box feature. And what we'll do is, for like the first half hour, 40 minutes, we'll have a back and forth with Brendan and with Mr. Johnson. And then I'll turn to all the questions that are in the chat box. So I'll try to get to those as soon as I can for all of you. And we'll try to address as many as we can before the discussion is over. So with those preliminary thoughts, it's probably time to get started. And let's lay the groundwork for this discussion with your thoughts, Brendan, and for your perspective. Can you provide us with a high-level overview of the budget reconciliation process? You just went through this a few years ago with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and I know how much went into that to get that across the finish line. But maybe you could fill us in on this incredibly complex process that you were in the middle of just a few years ago.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. I am going to do it at a high level because I think that while I've been around reconciliation quite a bit, as Mr. Johnson can attest, people can spend their entire lives working on nothing but the budget rules and still not necessarily have the answers as to how any particular issue is going to turn out. I think at a high level, the way that I view reconciliation is through the broader context of the Senate rules. The House, as we all know, could come in and from a Republican perspective, over the course of half a week, could repeal and replace the ACA, repeal Dodd-Frank, and pass a whole host of other tax-related items that are at the top of their agenda. In the Senate, as many of you have probably heard me say before, you can't get a Mother's Day resolution done in a rapid fashion without some sort of massive consent exercise. There are opportunities in the Senate where supermajority requirements to cut off debate are relaxed, right? One of them is trade promotion authority, right? Where you have an expedited process and a guaranteed up or down vote, limited time for debate at a simple majority threshold. Something we're going to see, we saw at the beginning of the last administration, and we're going to see, I think, at the beginning of this administration, is the Congressional Review Act process, where you have guaranteed vote, limited debate, 50 vote threshold. What reconciliation provides is that under I would say, very constrained rules. Of course, constrained rules as to what can get into a bill, but of course, those rules do open up probably north of 50% of federal spending or a substantial amount of federal spending through mandatory spending and then also tax. But so long as you're within those bounds, it creates an opportunity for limited debate and a final resolution at 50 votes. And I think the short version, Mr. Johnson can elaborate on this. I think the short version is you can have 3 reconciliation instructions that go out to different committees for every budget resolution, for every fiscal year budget resolution. So what we saw in 2017 was that you had the FY 2017 budget resolution created a reconciliation instruction for the purpose of ACA repeal. And then the FY 2018 budget resolution that was enacted later in the fall, created the reconciliation instruction for what became tax reform. I think the short version of this is that you can do tax, you can do mandatory spending, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, unemployment insurance, basically anything with a formula in it, you can do through reconciliation, with the exception of Social Security, which I think is very important that we come back to at some point. And then you can do debt limit. And so that's what's available to you. And I think it's no surprising that given what's available, that is what's available. That's what Congress ran with the last time that we used this exercise in 2017. So with that, Joe, I'll kick it back to you. Joe, I think you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Brendan. I appreciate that. And Mr. Johnson, you have had extraordinary experience as assistant parliamentarian, and having experienced the reconciliation process in the most significant way. So can you give us some of your thoughts on how it's been used in the past and what precedents exist at the present time?
Senator, I saw the House for 10 years or so before the Budget Act was enacted in 1964 or 1974. Prior to that, the Congress had no budget of its own separately formulated. It always relied on the administration's budget submitted since 1921 under the Congressional Budget and Accounting Act. But in the late 60s, with the Nixon administration and a Democratic House and Senate, the Budget Act was formulated to give Congress a separate ability to formulate and try to implement its own budget priorities over a 1 and eventually 5 and 10 year window. The so-called budget window is a term that the viewers will become familiar with maybe during this conversation. And also attached was the Impoundment Control Act. The need for Congress to have its own budget wasn't the only motivation for the Budget Act, but it included the Impoundment Control Act, where Nixon was allegedly and unconstitutionally withholding the availability of appropriated funds through rescissions and deferrals. So Title 10 of the Budget Act is the Impoundment Control Act and was one of the prime original motivations. But then when the Budget Act kicked in, and every year was different and has been through the many times the budget process has been used. Every process has been different. So the recitation of precedent is perhaps only of limited value. But that's because the whole premise of the Budget Act is an exercise in rulemaking, that each House under the Constitution can make its own rules. The Senate being less able between Congresses to change its rules, except by a rule which carries over saying that it takes a 2/3 vote of the Senate, not just 3/5, to directly change Senate rules. But the House does change its rules and readopt most of its rules, including the Budget Act, every 2 years. So the budget process is in effect readopted every 2 years, as it was on opening day, January 4th this year, by the House. But the primary reason for reconciliation is fast tracking, and that applies primarily in the Senate. Fast tracking meaning avoidance of what would otherwise be impediments to expeditious consideration. Now, the House can expedite consideration of the budget resolution itself, which it does through utilization of the Rules Committee. And then upon final adoption of a budget resolution by both houses, the House can expedite consideration of the reconciliation bill, the purpose of which, as Brennan has already said, is to put in place a set of priorities, that congressional priorities on tax, on revenue, spending, and deficit. Now, the Senate does not enjoy a rules committee, a majoritarian rules committee, which can waive points of order. In fact, waivers of points of order under the Budget Act in the Senate, either by directly waiving what has been acknowledged to be a point of order by the presiding officer, or even waiving, overturning the chair on appeal, which I don't think happened, but it can also happen, require 3/5 votes to get to the underlying proceeding. So the whole question of how, in the face, as we will discuss, of the parliamentarians' advice and the chair's possible rulings with respect to Senate interpretation of the Budget Act, and particularly the Byrd Rule, the ultimate arbiter is the Senate. But it's the Senate in terms of 3/5, 60, it's not a floating number, it's 3/5 of its membership if there's an attempted waiver once the chair has sustained a point of order or an appeal from the ruling of the chair. Something that the viewers need to keep an eye on going forward. But as has been suggested, the notion of fast track is primarily a way of enacting into law, as an exercise in rulemaking, the ability of the Senate in this important context of budget formulation and legislative response, meaning that both houses have to pass a bill in its exact form to present to the president in order to enact budget policy into law. It doesn't happen merely by itself by adoption of a congressional budget resolution, which is only a preliminary step toward formulation through instructions by the budget resolution to various committees. And what can and cannot be contained in those instructions is itself a topic which is perhaps too lengthy to get into, but the budget committees on both sides and respective legislative committees are given instructions to formulate policy in revenue, spending, and deficit and debt areas, which will accomplish the underlying purpose of that particular budget resolution already adopted. And when the committees start, they have a certain period of time specified to report recommendations to the budget committee, which in turn packages those recommendations without substantive change. Now in the House, that budget recommendation can be changed by the Rules Committee and adopted by the House in the form of an amendment contained in the rule making the reconciliation bill in order. Most of this discussion, I think, will go off on Senate consideration.
Yeah.
But what the House can and cannot do is important for the reader to know. And again, I point to Congressional Research Service report number RL 30862 by William Hennef, the acknowledged budget expert with the Congressional Research Service for the Library of Congress. It's online, available to all through that the Congressional Research Service.
That's great. Thank you so much. That's just unbelievably informative. And we'll also have that site for anybody who may have missed it, and we can mention it again before the end of this hour. So where we find ourselves now is next Wednesday at noon, President-elect Biden will become President Biden. And President Biden has proposed a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, and it will be going before the Senate and going before the House. And when it does, that is when folks are going to start looking and going, okay, now how does this eventually come to fruition? Part of it, all of it, none of it. And so Brendan, one of the things that's going to happen is Senator McConnell will be the leader of the Republicans. And as this package goes to the Senate, they'll be looking to get 60 votes. And so how does Senator McConnell, and not only Senator McConnell, but as you mentioned to me yesterday when we were discussing this, you said, is it really Senator McConnell, or is it getting his blessing to move forward, or is it getting 10 Republicans to move forward? So I'll turn that over to you.
Sorry, Joe. I think that it's important here to note that I think the entire backdrop of the next year to 2 years is the threat from a Republican perspective associated with the ability of the Democrats to change the rules and modify any rules. So not just rules around the filibuster, but really any rule in the Senate if you have a determined 50 votes on the Democratic side. And so I think that one of what I would expect Republicans to do, understanding that if there is a mass blockade of all legislation, no matter how reasonable, that I do think that you are basically egging on the Democrats to take pretty drastic action on the filibuster that would not redound to Republicans' benefit. And so I think that what you're going to see is, however we want to characterize it, whether it's rope-a-dope on the part of Republicans, or whether it's whether it's periodically letting some air out of the balloon, right? So letting some steam out. I do think that it is in the Republicans' interest to allow things to go forward when they can go forward, and to not, throw roadblocks in the way of everything. I think one place that you'll see that will be on nominations, right, where Republicans can't really stop nominations now that it's a 50-vote threshold, but they certainly can slow walk nominations. I think that we're going to have a question right out of the gate as to how Republicans react to President Biden's COVID stimulus proposal. My sense is that it is quite rich right now to attract 10 Republicans who would participate in it. But President Biden is a deal maker. We'll see whether they can get to something that would have enough Republican support that you could do it at 60 votes. I think if you can't get there, either because Republicans refuse to sign off on anything, or because the president, in dealing with, I think, the lion's share of his members in Congress who are kind of eager to do a really substantial bill, leaving him unable to really meet Republicans in the middle. If that's the case, I think we're going to see reconciliation very quickly, and it can happen very quickly. A budget can be passed with a reconciliation instruction, probably to the Finance Committee, saying, give us a reconciliation bill, right? And so just so we have a sense here on both timing and content, when I say it can happen quickly, when Republicans failed on Obamacare repeal in July of 2017 for the last time, they went home for the August recess and had absolutely nothing that they could come back to in September. By September 29th, the Republican Budget Committee in the Senate was marking up a budget, a 2018 budget with a reconciliation instruction to finance. It passed the House on October 5th. It passed the Senate on October 19th. It was all resolved by October 26th, and then we know how tax reform went, and that was a very complicated policy effort, I think, by comparison with what we would see in a COVID bill, which is taking a lot of things off the shelf that are kind of already done. I'd also note the way this would work is that you have the budget, the FY 2018 budget that was done in September of October for the purpose of tax reform. It was a lot of pages, but it was really just 3 lines that mattered. And this is all that we would get. The Committee on Finance, this is the TCJA language, the TCJA budget language. The Committee on Finance and the Senate shall report changes in laws within its jurisdiction that increase the deficit by not more than $1.5 trillion for the period of FY 2018 through 27. And I think that that's what you would get. You can obviously do the types of things that we've talked about. You can obviously do checks and UI, which, if they're liberal enough, can probably push you up around $1 trillion just by themselves. And then we'll see about what other items could be added on. I would note that one of the things that appeared in the President Biden's proposal yesterday, minimum wage increase to $15 an hour, is kind of your paradigmatic case of the type of thing that would not be permissible under reconciliation.
So as you look at this, if this bill is not, obviously won't be embraced by the Republican leadership, but if they say we're going to whip it or whatever, do you think there's a point somewhere in it that you get 10 votes and after that point they start to go away a little bit? Like, is there a number in your mind? Obviously components matter as well. But in shorthand, is there a number or region where you look and you go, at 1.3, you get 10, at 1.6, you get 6, and then you're short?
Yeah, Joe, I would say it's as much the policy as the number. I think that once you start to layer in, and I don't know what it would be, right? But I think that the one way to think of this is the more policy that looks like it's permanent policy as opposed to temporary COVID policy, right? UI, and checks are obviously oriented around the COVID experience. You start getting into changes on EITC or CTC, things like that. All of a sudden, that looks like the nose under the tent for more permanent policy down the road. So I think that it's a combination, right? You start to drift too high above $1 trillion, you start to lose members. You start to add policies that look like they're efforts to lay the groundwork for something more permanent, you start to lose members. I think there's a secondary question, which is what are McConnell and Thune, what's their posture going to be toward all of this? I think that's anybody's guess right now. I wouldn't pretend to have an idea. I will say, though, that I think that, you look at the the 2009 experience with the ACA, where Republicans went all in, leadership went all in to stop that. I think that they look at that, and that is, you know, something that is permanent. It is a new entitlement. It is ideologically problematic from the Republicans' perspective. I don't know how ideologically problematic, you know, might be policy problematic, but I don't think that, you know, a UI extension is going to, you know, fundamentally change the country.
Yeah, I think, you know, looking at it from the perspective of President Biden, and I don't pretend to speak for him, but he's got to be looking at this as, I can't afford to simply wind up with nothing here. That I have to either do it through this legislation, if not that, reconciliation, if not that, filibuster change, so that I can get this done. But at the end of the day, to wind up with very little is got to be a non-starter, because it immediately sets the tone. This is going to immediately set the tone of what happens in Washington, I think. And so if you look at this and you can't get to 60, then the next step may be this reconciliation that we're discussing. And so the question then becomes, what can be included via reconciliation and what can't? I was looking at the list of things on this legislation: $1,400 checks, $15 minimum wage, rental assistance, health premium subsidies, $350 billion to help states with COVID costs. And so it becomes the question of what can pass the test and what can't pass the test. And Mr. Johnson, you were saying earlier to us that in the Senate, and this is important, when the Senate parliamentarian makes a decision, this can go or this can't. If there's an appeal, it's not just a 50-50 appeal, is it, sir? It's a 3/5 that you have to get.
Yes, sir. It's a 3/5 requirement to overturn what the chair's ruling is. Now, that itself is problematic to measure. If the parliamentarian's advice, which traditionally in the Senate has always been taken, you asked me, Senator, earlier to mention several earlier examples of the importance of the parliamentarian's advice. I referred the viewers to the CRS report cryptically to give them the ability to access the three of the major areas, and I'll just mention them: the tax reductions in 2001, the Affordable Care Act, where two bills were required, one which met the parameters of reconciliation under the Byrd Rule, one which did not, but which the Senate did in fact permit to go ahead by the precise number of senators needed, 60. But then those two bills, one amending the other, but passed at the same time, if you will, were both presented as separate bills to the president with Obama on health care. And then, of course, the more recent efforts on tax reduction, first the repeal of Obamacare, and then which was stymied in the Senate, and then tax reduction, which was successful. But all through that, the role of the parliamentarian in advising the presiding officer is very important, because, as I mentioned earlier, the Senate doesn't have the ability of the leadership to self-appointed in the House by the Speaker, 9 of 13, very important ratio, 9 of 13 members in the House comprising the majority of the Rules Committee, to bring a rule virtually overnight to the attention of the House for a majority vote on waivers.
And in the parliamentarian's role is, as that parliamentarian looks at it, that parliamentarian, you know, one of the things I remember so well from when I was involved in these is that parliamentarian is not making decisions as the Republican parliamentarian or as the Democratic parliamentarian, but is very, very dedicated to being the impartial arbiter who follows the rules, the Byrd rule and everything else connected with this. Isn't that a pretty fair assumption, Charles?
Yes, it is, sir. And the pressures on her and her office, which by the way was just ransacked quite extensively, and the impact on their functional capability, knowing that the resourcefulness of that office, they'll be up to the task. But their efforts on behalf of all who inquire, mainly senators and their staffs, who have access to the Senate parliamentarian and who go through exhaustive discussions of what is and is not includable in a reconciliation bill. And it's a nonpartisan bit of advice. The chair has, my understanding, always followed it. Sometimes that advice, although not published in terms of written memoranda, is distributed to information about the parliamentarian's possible advice is distributed for distribution, or at least for an indication of what the advice will be. So it puts the Senate parliamentarian under constant scrutiny, but she's up to the task of giving the best advice based on prior advice, but also with the knowledge that that's a new bill with new provisions, and has to be each provision has to be analyzed on its own.
I will say this as a personal point of privilege real quick, which is Elizabeth, the parliamentarian, Miss McDonough, the parliamentarian in the Senate, is as good as any that have ever sat in that chair. Her talents are incredible. She's as fair as it comes and does an extraordinary job. And as you said, all of our hearts were broken by the terrorist attack against our Capitol last week. And that picture of the parliamentarian's office that they ransacked it, Charles, because that's where fair, impartial decisions come from. And that's not what those people wanted. I'm sorry, Brendan, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, I concur with that. I concur with everything that's just been said. I would add, Joe, you started out asking kind of what qualifies, what doesn't. Tax is the easiest, right? I mean, tax is the easiest. You're going to sit down and they'll litigate it. And when I say litigate, and let me emphasize the word litigate here. There is not a great answer to these things, these questions as to what gets in and gets out, for the same reason that there's not a great answer prior to the trial as to how Jones versus McGillicuddy is going to turn out, right? Because it has to be litigated, right? They're both sides. They make their case, right? They present their evidence. And only then do you get a resolution. And as we know, the Byrd rule, which is really when you say it's being litigated, that's what's being litigated. Whether an individual provision is consistent with the Byrd rule. They're doing that with staff locked up in a room in the Capitol for in some cases, weeks on end in advance of a bill ever getting to the floor, provision by provision. That's what happened with TCJA. That is certainly what happened with the ACA repeal and effort at repeal in 2017. And even though the Democrats might not be participating vote-wise in either of those efforts, they are certainly making their case in the presentation to Elizabeth and the rest of the parliamentarians team as to whether a provision should be in or out. And I'll give you an example, right? It is pretty of something that should be clear, but maybe less than clear. The Byrd rule specifically excludes from the possibility of a reconciliation bill
And Brendan,
matters related.
could you give us about a 2-sentence summary of what the Byrd Rule is so that everybody
Well,
knows?
look, Mr. Johnson's going to do a better job than I would. The short version is, if it impacts numbers and there's not a lot of policy, you're probably in good shape. If instead, even if there's a number associated with it, but you're looking at 500 pages of legislative text, that the number might be determined to be the language is merely incidental to the policy. And so you're looking at things like mandatory spending and tax are really your bread and butter. And then once you get beyond that, it gets a little more challenging for those who would like to put something into a reconciliation bill. So I gave the example of minimum wage earlier. Minimum wage is all policy. It is hard to see how minimum wage could be shoehorned into a reconciliation bill as the rules currently exist. What about Social Security? Social Security, changes to Social Security are specifically prohibited by the Byrd Rule. Inclusion of matters related to Social Security is fatal to a reconciliation bill. It can bring the entire bill down. Okay. Well, what about changes to the payroll tax? Right. So we can rest assured a payroll tax increase is a pretty significant part of then candidate Biden's overall tax proposal. Does a payroll tax increase necessarily implicate the Social Security program? I think that something that on the Republicans would say, I think this is pretty clear. The Byrd Rule prohibits changes to Social Security. You shouldn't be able to do a payroll tax increase. I suspect that the Democrats might be on different side from that, and will probably have a very strong case to make when they go before Elizabeth and the Parliamentarian if they decide to go down that road. So that's a long way of saying the question of what's in and what's out. At the margins, it's easy. Changes to marginal tax rates are easy, right? Changes to a Medicare formula are probably easy. Anything in between, you're going to have a nice little fist fight between the respective parties on this when they litigate it before the Parliamentarian.
Well, let me throw this out to both of you. It's a question from our folks who are watching the Zoom. Can a public option health proposal be included in reconciliation? Would that qualify?
Joe, I think that goes to the point I was just making. I think the Republicans would probably say, under no circumstances can a public option be compliant with reconciliation rules and would have to drop out of a reconciliation bill. I think that new chairman of the Budget Committee, Bernie Sanders, might have a different view on that. So I don't know that there's a crystal clear answer on that until it's actually resolved.
So that one may be like at Nats Park, where the umpire's standing there and has the managers on either side telling them why the run scores or the guy sliding into home plate is out, I guess is what that means. So it's pretty well, that really comes down to, I'm sorry?
Without a replay.
Without a replay. That
Except
really
by appeal.
that really comes down to the parliamentarian call on that kind of thing. So as you look at this, the 50-50 split, how does that impact, do you think, on reconciliation being used, and how much influence do moderate House Democrats have on this process?
Well, I can jump in and take that. I think that the 50-50 split is an important question in the Senate. In the end, I don't know that it's any more or less important than addressing the thin majorities that Speaker Pelosi has, right? I mean, we're focused on the public. Let's use public option as an example. A lot of focus, reasonably, on whether or not a public option would be compliant with reconciliation rules in the Senate. But that's kind of putting the cart before the horse. The threshold question is whether, Abigail Spanberger and other moderate Democrats in the House want to do a public option. And do Senator Manchin and Senator Kelly, who's up for re-election in 22, and Senator Sinema, do they want to do a public option? Because whether or not it's consistent with reconciliation is moot if you wouldn't have 50 votes for it in any event.
And it's also important, Senator, because this reconciliation bill, if there is one, is likely to be a revenue bill, that it originate in the House under the Constitution, that to the point that the Senate will be operating on the House bill initially. What amendments it can offer to it would have to be to a bill with an HR number. So the House will be mindful from the beginning, not that it itself faces the Byrd Rules application on its own language, but on the eventual and perhaps inevitable application of a Byrd point of order against House-originated language if it emerges subsequently in the Senate in a conference report or in an amendment between the two houses. And it's at that late stage where something that is extraneous and can't get a 3/5 waiver in the Senate drops out of what is even a final conference package and becomes in effect, and could happen to more than one provision, becomes a new Senate proposed amendment to a House amendment, which the House would have to consider all over again, even if it's adopted a final conference report. So the indirect application of the Byrd Rule in the House, while not explicitly applicable in the House, is very important for the eventual outcome of the bill.
So is there a timing point where the House and Senate look at this and go, we have to do a reconciliation bill now, or this is going to get away from us? I mean, say they've not been able to get 60 votes. Is there a time, like for the FY21 reconciliation bill, that they have to pull the trigger and do this, or that option goes away from them?
Joe, I think that it's an open question whether or not a reconciliation, and this is a parliamentarian question, whether or not a reconciliation bill associated with a certain fiscal year's budget would continue to be available when you're in a new fiscal year, right? So this is something that was discussed in 2017. Now, as it turns out, it was an FY 2017 budget that was used in FY 2017 to provide the vehicle to repeal the ACA. And then it was an FY 2018 budget that was enacted with a reconciliation instruction after September 30th, 2017. So you're now into FY 2018 so you're using an FY 2018 in FY 2018. I think it is an open question, right? Like, let's say, I do think this is a really academic exercise. Let's say for some reason the FY, what are we in now? We're at the FY 2021 reconciliation. There was an FY 2021 budget with a reconciliation instruction, and it wasn't used. And we're now in November of 21, which is FY 22. Could you use it? I think that that's an open question, but it's one that didn't have to be litigated.
I think the Senate may have had a ruling on that in 2017 when the repeal of the Affordable Care Act stopped. The chair indicated through advice of the parliamentarian, I believe it came to an actual suggestion, if not a ruling by the chair, that a new budget resolution first had to be triggered for 18 after September 30th to then allow tax reduction to become the focus, but it had to be in a directive contained in a subsequent budget resolution for the subsequent fiscal year. I believe that is a precedent in the Senate. If it didn't reach that status, I'd stand corrected, but it's certainly worth checking.
Let me ask you
Okay.
about a topic or something you may have heard, the nuclear option for the Byrd rule. And so incoming Senate Budget Chairman Bernie Sanders has suggested that, or it's been mentioned that he may feel that the vice president, as the Senate's presiding officer, could simply brush aside parliamentary concerns like the Byrd rule. Is that possible?
I think it's half right. Let's take a step back, right? And Joe, you were here when all of this unfolded. You were in the Senate when all of this unfolded. The Senate rules about the Senate rules are very clear. A formal change to the Senate rules requires a 2/3 vote. Okay. The Senate rules are also very clear that in order to cut off debate on a nominee, this is still the case, on a nominee or legislation, it requires 60 votes, okay? But today, we cut off debate on nominations at 50 votes without ever having enacted a 2/3 rule change, right? So how does that happen? Effectively, right, and this is the nuclear option, it's not really the chair just doing whatever they want, although I guess that's possible. The way that it worked with the rules change on the filibuster of judges and executive branch nominations was, and this is a shorthand version, but you have a parliamentary inquiry as to whether the Senate rule allows for debate to be cut off on a judge at 50 votes. And Elizabeth, sitting at the dais, turns around and whispers to whoever's in the chair, no, of course that's not true. The Senate rule is clear. It requires 60 votes. At which point, whoever's in the chair says, Mr. Reed or Mr. McConnell, no, the rule is clear. It requires 60 votes. I move to overturn the ruling of the chair, right? That is a 50-vote exercise. And when you overturn the ruling of the chair, you create a new precedent. And so right now we operate in a world where judges and executive branch nominees, what the shorthand version that we all get into the habit of using is we eliminated the filibuster on judges and executive branch nominees. That's not true. The rule remains the same. The rule, if you look at the Senate rules published on the Senate Rules website, it requires 60 votes to cut off debate on a judge or an executive branch nominee, okay? We're doing it at 50 because we set a new precedent by overturning the ruling of the chair at 50 votes. From my perspective, and this is something that I think everybody on the phone needs to be conscious of. I started out by saying that the filibuster and the changes to the filibuster are the backdrop for this entire Congress, okay? Senator Manchin has indicated that he has no interest in changing the filibuster, okay? All the filibuster does is it allows you to get ordinary legislation. Eliminating the filibuster on legislation would allow you to get legislation done at 50 votes. If you were to modify the Byrd rule in a similar fashion, okay, you're not changing the filibuster, but you're effectively opening up the reconciliation process to policies that otherwise wouldn't would not fit into reconciliation. I'll use my example again of minimum wage, right? It doesn't fit within reconciliation, but by overturning the ruling of the chair on their interpretation of Byrd, you might be able to shoehorn it in. I'll note just really quickly, Mr. Johnson, I see you got you want to jump in. I think that this is important. I'm going to give you an example. I began by mentioning TPA, right? We have other, and I think, you'll hear folks say that the Congressional Budget Act and these rules are in statute, right? This is not just a Senate rule, and that is true. But I think I'm going to reference TPA and the expedited process for the Senate on trade agreements. That is also in statute. It's in Section 2191 of the Trade Act. There's all this discussion about Senate process, right? Kind of, it's like similar to Byrd. These are it's all this arcane procedural stuff. And you get to the very end, it says, of course, all of this that we just said is said, quote, with full recognition of the constitutional right of either chamber to change the rules at any time in the same manner and to the same extent as in the case of any other rule of that chamber, right? So in the end, Senate's judge of how it wants to do its own business. And so I think that this is, Joe, that's a lot of words spilled to say, yes, Senator Sanders is kind of right, and there might be an option available to him. And so I think that everybody who, thinks, well, I work in the financial services space, that's not really a place, or the labor space or the energy space, that's not really a space that ordinarily would have reconciliation available to it. I think that we need to be careful about making those assumptions.
Charles?
Senator, two quick reactions to Brendan's comment. It's important when you look at these nuclear option utilizations and the impact of a successful appeal in the Senate is like a black letter rules change without the Senate having directly amended the rule. And the precedential effect going forward into other similar issues like nominations. When the nuclear option was first applied in the Senate, it was on one district judge nomination. But the appeal was stated in very general terms and has been interpreted under prior rulings of the chair that once an appeal is successful in the Senate, it becomes the black letter rule until subsequently further changed by a new Senate rules change, which happened on the airdrop rule provoked by the so-called FedEx ruling all way back in the 90s, where the Senate, to get at a proposition, overruled the chair, allowed extraneous matter to come in and live with that rule for several years until Byrd himself put it back in the stricter airdrop rule to reinforce the inability of the Senate to go outside the scope. But this case now, and I mentioned it earlier, is further, perhaps in my mind, is further complicated by the statement in the Budget Act that appeals, not just rulings of the chair, but appeals therefrom are likewise subject to a 3/5 vote to waive. Now, whether you have to go an additional step to apply a nuclear option to that part of the Budget Act, I don't know, but I think it's a further complication in this context.
This has been just an unbelievably interesting, complex discussion about what we face. And what I think we're looking at come Wednesday at noon is in effect three things intertwining. The filibuster, the regular legislative process, and the process for reconciliation as President Biden's COVID relief package goes before our legislature. And with an understanding from President Biden's team and the Democrats that we will have some product passed in some way at the end of the day. And the Republican view being, and Brendan, you can put it much better than me, that we want to see a product pass that we think makes the most sense for our country. And so it's almost like it's like looking around at each other in a very wary way of, well, how far can we push before the Democrats move to reconciliation? And on the Democrat side, how much can we go that we don't have to go to reconciliation? And with the question of filibuster, having folks like Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, Senator King, in effect saying, we don't want to change it, but we're not going to just sit by if it's abused. Brendan?
Joe, can just really briefly, I want to make sure that I'm capturing it right. Can you just restate it just again?
I was just saying that it's very much, as we're looking right now, almost like there's it's kind of a wariness of trying to feel each other out as to how to move forward in this process. The Democrats want to get a finished product that's as strong as it can be. The Republicans want to get one the most to their liking. And you have at this moment, a unique moment, a potential filibuster change, a potential reconciliation, and the legislation all kind of coming into the same space.
Yeah, I think that, all of this, again, I keep saying it, I think that this debate over reconciliation is really inseparable from the debate over filibuster reform, to the extent that the president is able to enact big pieces of his agenda early on without either through reconciliation or, there's no reason that we can't have an ordinary appropriations process. There's no reason that Congress can't do things. I think that pushes off the filibuster conversation. I think that the fact that so much of the president's proposal on COVID relief can probably be enacted through some combination of either a 60-vote bill that encompasses everything, or a 60-vote supplemental appropriations bill, which might not be that hard, right? Appropriations can't be run through reconciliation, so you could do a 60-vote supplemental COVID reconciliation or COVID appropriations bill, and then you could run the rest of it, the tax and the UI, through reconciliation. All of a sudden, that's pushing you into March, and all of a sudden you have a situation where the Republicans have been cooperative on, probably, $2 trillion, in that range of new federal spending. And I think it maybe pushes off that filibuster conversation until a little bit later. And then the bookend here is that once the economy is back, assuming that the president wants to pursue his more aggressive tax agenda and knowing that there are TCJA items that need to be addressed at the end of this year, there's an opportunity at the end of the year to focus on another reconciliation package. So I think that there's going to be a lot going on that, as I put it, kind of lets some steam out of the, some air out of the balloon, and people are able to point to things that Congress is getting done. Republicans aren't objecting to everything. The president's getting his priorities done, and that helps to push off the filibuster debate further down the road.
Well, Mr. Johnson, thank you so much. Number one, for your service to our country. And number two, for the wisdom that you gave us today on this discussion. Brendan, thank you so much for all of your help and your wisdom in finding answers to this this really complex subject of reconciliation. And to everyone listening, thank you so much for being with us. And please know that everyone at Aiken that you work with is ready to answer any additional questions you might have. And I'm sure there are some, because we have a chat box filled with about 20 that we weren't able to have the time to get to. To Shiny Matthew and Lori Spielman and our Aiken Gump AV team, thank you so much for making this possible. And to all of you who are watching, thanks for your being here. Thanks for your confidence in Aiken Gump, and we hope you have a wonderful weekend.